Welcome, welcome. So feel free, if you like, to have eState. If you want to log into eState as we do this, you can try it on the side. It's always best to learn by doing, especially with software. And so if you want to try it as I do it and see what results you get or see any problems you have, and then just shout out if you've got any issues. But today, we're going to talk about designations, beneficiary designations, and how eState deals with those, and get some feedback from you guys on, if there's features that you want on this. We have a bunch for beneficiary designations that we have on our list, but we'd love to hear from you as well. We're joined as always by Michaela, thank you, who heads our support at eState. And let's get going. I'm going to share my screen and welcome. Feel free if you want to enter any questions in chat, and we'll make sure to get that. And then there'll be a period. We'll spend about 15 minutes on this part, and then I'll open the floor to questions about eState and any specific questions you have about how to use it or whatever. So I've got Homer and his family here. And when we're talking about beneficiary designations, of course, there's a limited number of assets where we can designate a beneficiary, right? They're governed by the Insurance Act, and they're governed by the Succession Law Reform Act in Ontario. And every province has their own act that governs things like designation of beneficiaries for RSPs, TFSAs, pensions, locked-in retirement funds, those kinds of things. So those are the things we're going to be talking about, those special assets that you can designate a beneficiary on. And I always refer to them as a mini will to my clients, because in essence, that's what they are. So if we look down this list of Homer's assets, we see a few that we can designate a beneficiary on: RSP, life insurance, TFSA. So those we can designate a beneficiary on. So how do we do that? Well, we use the same scenario planning as you would use for any other gift. We start with, what do we want to do if Marge is alive, right? Homer's spouse. And we have the box for joint and designated assets. This is where we're going to drag these assets that we want to designate a beneficiary for into. So on the left are all the assets we can drag and drop. So we can click on the RSP, drag it into the green box. Now we have to pick who the beneficiary should be for that asset. And most likely in the surviving spouse scenario, you'd pick the spouse, and we'd go done, just like that. And again, once we've given one asset to Marge, we can give other assets without having to recreate that box again. What we would do is, if we wanted to have Marge as the beneficiary of your TFSA, then we would just grab it and drop it into the gray box here below Marge, and then it'll automatically get added to Marge's list of assets. So that's how we do that. You can also appoint, as an example, you could appoint more than one beneficiary, and I'll show you how to do that in the second scenario. So what eState does with that information, it's a couple things. The first thing it does is it lists those assets under here in the summary. So it's total assets, and then it shows you assets that are going by designation or joint assets. So in this case, they're both designated assets, and it's $130,000. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to look at the income tax savings on that. So we have income tax on RSPs, obviously, and by designating a spouse as the beneficiary, we can show that we've saved basically the income tax on the RSP. And of course, we've also saved probate tax by making a designated beneficiary. So that's that. What if, as an example, we wanted, I'll just delete that asset, we wanted to make the estate the beneficiary of the TFSA, for example? Well, we would drag the TFSA into the green box, because a new beneficiary, and then you'll see people, charities, and other. So if we click other, that's where you can see the estate. And if we click that, now the estate is the beneficiary of that $30,000 TFSA. The difference is that it knows that we're not saving probate tax on that asset because we're designating the estate. So that's the interplay between the designation of beneficiaries and joint designated assets and the summary and the calculation of income tax and probate tax and those kinds of things. So far, so good, I hope. So like anything else, then you'd go to the second scenario and deal with that gift. So let's talk about life insurance as an example. Let's actually go back, because typically what you'd want is the life insurance to go to the spouse, let's say, designate the spouse as the beneficiary of that. Again, you would just drag and drop it in there. So then we go to descendants only. So the spouse is not alive, but the kids are alive. Well, we've got young kids. We're probably not going to want to designate a beneficiary on those. Because if we want everything to go to the kids, then we're not going to designate a beneficiary because they're young. We typically don't, recommend that. But sometimes people want to do it. So you can do that. You can drag and drop the RSP, and you'll note that there's no ability to name a class as a beneficiary. My children as the beneficiary of my RSP, because don't forget, this is going to a financial institution that is going to have to make sure that they pay it out properly. They don't want to figure out who's in the class, children predeceased or any of those things. They want to say, is it this person? Is it this person? Is it this person? So at eState, we do not allow a class beneficiary for designations. We require you to pick people to do that for that reason, because again, otherwise what's going to happen is that money is going to get paid into court if the bank or the financial institution or the life insurance company can't figure out who are the beneficiaries, and using a class really is a problem. So that's how we would, just so you know, if you're looking for class, that's why that doesn't work. I want to then just show a couple things and then create the designations. And so if I go to my warnings here, one of the things that we've got is whether we want to obviously see prior designations and things like that. Let me just show you an example where so as we all know, the estate is typically responsible for the tax on the RSP, regardless of the beneficiary designation. The beneficiary gets the full amount, but the estate, the residue in essence, pays the tax. Whenever eState sees that there's a possibility for a disconnect between the tax burden of the RSP and the residue and the beneficiary of the RSP, it's going to give us a warning. So right here, it saw that the beneficiary, the residuary beneficiary, was different than the beneficiaries of the RSP. And so it's warning us, oh, we've got a tax disconnect there. And so make sure that we clarify with the client. If those are their instructions, document that very well. If that's not the instructions, then come up with some other plan. I'm not a big fan of having a disconnect there for the amount of probate tax savings. I'd much rather have the estate, have the RSP go through the estate so we can deal with it properly and have the tax burden follow the gift rather than dealing with a beneficiary designation. And I think we've talked about that before at our eState advanced webinars. But obviously that's a major issue with RSPs, that the tax is paid by the residue rather than by the designated beneficiary. So I just point that out. So let's just create, let me show you two different ways of dealing with this. So the first is a beneficiary life insurance designation. Now, many people, me included, prefer that a life insurance designation, if we're doing one, be dealt with in a separate document so that we don't have to send the entire will to the insurance company. And so this is your typical life insurance declaration. Just call that back up, that you can see. And this is how eState drafts it. It does one for each policy. So if you had 3 policies all going to the same people, we do one for each policy so that it can be shipped to the proper insurance company if they're different insurance companies, et cetera. And there's a separate designation for each policy. So you can see what eState does. It says, okay, if Marge is alive, pay it to Marge as the beneficiary. That's what we did. But it also saw that we didn't have a beneficiary designation for life insurance in subsequent scenarios. We left it blank. So what we did at eState is we assumed that what most people would want, which is, I want those proceeds to be paid to my executors. And if I had named executors, which I didn't do, so let me just name an executor. So let's name Marge first, because she would likely be the executor. And then if Marge can't do it, I want, not Bart, that's for sure, Daniel. Okay, Daniel. So let me just regenerate that because I'll show you how eState would handle this designation. Again, we're doing a separate life insurance declaration for each document, for each policy. So here we go. And so what eState does is if it sees that the life insurance has been given away in one scenario, but not given away in others, it assumes that what you would want is it to go to the executor as trustee of those proceeds to deal with on the same terms as the residue of your estate. And so that's how by default eState drafts it. So it says pay it to Marge if she's alive, but if she's not alive, then our Act, Section 193, allows a trustee to be appointed for proceeds of life insurance. And so it says pay it to, and it knew that Marge was dead, so it put the next estate trustee in place, Daniel as trustee of the proceeds, and then they are to deal with it on the same manner and on the same terms as provided for in my will. So that's how eState deals with that kind of designation. And again, if that wasn't the intention, if they didn't want to do it, you just simply delete that paragraph and that's fine. But in most cases, that's what you would want. If you're leaving it blank, you probably don't want it to go through the estate, probably would prefer it to go through, use a trustee and to deal with it on the same terms as the will. So it's pretty standard wording on that front. So that's how an insurance declaration works. Let me now show you how it would work, how an RSP designation might work. So I'm just going to go to a single will. I think I've mentioned last week about designation options. So now you can choose what kind of designations you want to include in your will, either as a default, to start with, and you can always change that per client. So our default, my default, for example, was only include registered plans designation in my wills. But if I wanted to add, my insurance declaration in my will, I could do that. If I wanted to include a joint and designated asset confirmation, I could do that as well. So let's put that one in. I'm just going to do that, and then I'm going to just generate this. So the point is that typically, and right now we don't support a separate document for RSP designations like we do for life insurance. Typically, they're not as large, and so we're not as concerned about that, but that is something that we're going to build because we have had people who, a bunch of firms who have said, well, I would like a similar type of document for RSP designation. So we're going to do that. So you can see here, hopefully you can see that okay, but this is your RSP designations or registered plan designations. So it lists the RSPs, it designates the spouse as the beneficiary of the RSP. Now, so eState saw that the RSP, that Marge was not getting all of the registered assets. So it knew that it had to carve those out and deal with them separately. And that's what, if you had given Marge the RSP and the TFSA, it would have said, make her the successor subscriber of my TFSA and beneficiary of my registered assets, because it would have seen that all of the registered assets were going to her. So it kind of knows that automatically. And then it designated the TFSA to my estate, right? And then it designated, I think I had an alternate beneficiary for Abraham and Bart as the beneficiaries of the RSP if the spouse was not alive and if I left issue alive, descendants alive. So that's your typical RSP designation. And then just on this front, some people like to include, especially if there's a disconnect between who the residuary beneficiaries are and the beneficiaries of RSPs or joint assets. This just confirms that I really mean it when I've designated a beneficiary, that they're to take it as a right of basically a beneficial entitlement as well. So that's the idea. That is basically what I wanted to cover on RSP and TFSA and life insurance designations through eState. So that's how you do it. And we continue to make modifications to that. We're going to come up with a way that you can create more complicated designations where not just simply to one person, but dividing the proceeds and things like that. So we're working on that as well. And if that's something that you're interested in, we'd love to hear from you on that as well. So I think there's a few questions here that I'll try to answer. And yes, so what do you think about doing a designation in the will versus having it done by the client and through their advisor? There's really two schools of thought. I've gone back and forth in my career, and that's why we give you the option to include designations in your wills or not. So even though you can show the planning, so just to understand that, I could show the planning to the client of what's going on, but not include a designation in the will. And the way I would do that is when I created the document, as an example, I would, because let's say for this one example, I didn't want to include the designation, I would just exclude that. And now, even though I've shown what would happen, I'm not doing the designations. Okay, so that's how that would work. You know what? I think it depends on your preference. I mean, I think in a perfect world, it would be great to just say, just do it yourself. And if it's complicated, I often do that. But the problem, of course, is that this can, think of the dramatic effect that can have on the plan, not only the value of that RSP, but the tax burden. And so if there's disconnect there, and we haven't documented it, and we haven't warned the client, and we haven't done that, there is some potential liability, I think, there. I don't know if it'd be successful, but it would make you feel a little bit hot, under the collar about that. So I prefer to, at least if we're not going to do the designations, then at least show them the impact of that, because that's really important. And you'll know in our reporting letter, I'm just going to show you this because this ties right into that. So if we're including or excluding designations, the reporting letter will cover this off. So did I include RSP beneficiary designation? So if I didn't, okay, let me just generate this. And I don't know if this will work because I haven't put in any data, but let's see what happens. So here's our standard reporting letter. And this is why a reporting letter is very important. One of the sections in the reporting letter is registered beneficiary designations, right? So I just talk about, first of all, the impact of an RSP designation, but also confirming that I have not included a designation beneficiary because you've advised me that you've made them on all your plans. And so I'm not independently verifying. And as I just said, there's can be, all these benefits to doing it. And so eState knows, it saw. So how did it know that you've advised me about valid beneficiary designation? It saw that the client had registered assets and we didn't deal with them. And so it's saying, you better have, reminded the client to make sure that they have beneficiary designations on it. And so it covers it off in the reporting letter. So hope that helped. Yes, it automatically sets up the spouse as the successor holder automatically. That is right. So then, Brody, you ask a great question, which is, I mentioned this in passing, our Insurance Act says that you can designate a trustee for a beneficiary. For life insurance, that's actually Section 193. The Succession Law Reform Act does not have a similar provision for appointing a trustee for RSP designations. And so some firms are concerned about designating a trustee for it. That's one of the reasons we don't do it. For RFP designations, we haven't created that because we understand that there is some argument that that is not valid. And so we'd rather, if you're going to do it yourself rather than us saying you can do it. But there are, I mean, I don't think it's a problem, my personal view, because I think what you could do is designate this person, in essence, that as long as the banks would pay that money out to that person, the designated beneficiary, that's fine. One of the things that I would do if I were doing that kind of thing. So think about it this way. It's the last designation that matters. So what I would typically do if I'm going to use a trustee for an RSP designation, I'd say, okay, client, go to the bank, designate X, who's the person who's going to be the trustee, as the beneficiary of that. Do that on day one. Now come to me and sign your will on day 3, and we'll do a new designation that names the same person, X, as the beneficiary, as trustee, and then blah, blah, blah. Well, now the bank is going to pay it out to that X. They don't care about whether, I mean, not that they don't care. They may not care whether they're receiving it as a trustee or not, but yet the X is bound to hold that money as a trustee because this is a later designation. So that might be a little way of, getting that to work properly. I'm not strictly endorsing that. I'm just saying that's something to think about. In the event that the life insurance, James, in the event that the life insurance policy includes contingent beneficiaries of the individual and are also deceased, yes. So if you run out of beneficiaries on an insurance declaration, our Insurance Act says, it's paid to the estate of the owner. So that's who it gets paid to, and it would flow through the will as if the estate had been designated as the beneficiary. So I think those were the questions. Any comments on designations, or how we call them JADA, joint and designated assets, in our firm and at eState, how JADA works and how that kind of, any questions about that? Just unmic and unmute and just jump in. Yeah.
Excuse me, Jordy.
Yeah.
I might have missed it, but were you going to demo how to designate an asset to more than one beneficiary?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's do that. I did. I didn't, but let me show you. So what we would do is, let's say the RSP is going to more than one beneficiary. So we drag it into the green box, drop it, just pick your beneficiaries. Done. Okay. What I was just saying is that you can't use a class. We don't allow you to use a class, but you can pick individuals.
Oh, thank you.
Just one other point. Thanks for raising that. One other point is, we don't really allow gift overs. So RSP designations, they're supposed to be simple, right? That's the thing. And so, the risk is that if you're naming it to these people and you actually want it to be a gift over to their kids if they're not alive, this is not going to work great. And so it's a warning to the client that, yeah, you're going to save probate tax of this, but you may not have an equal distribution, because if one of these people die, let's say they were all equal residuary beneficiaries and they all had gift overs to their issue, for example. Well, that's different than, this is like a per capita distribution, right? Versus the residue, which might be a stirpital distribution. And so you could have a disconnect if there's a predeceasing beneficiary of the RSP. So that's something, to remind the client of if they're going to do that. Anything else? there were a couple points there about had trouble providing the insurance declaration to the insurance company because they need the client's consent to do so. I just typically just say to the client, you give it to your insurance company. I mean, that's kind of crazy. But I guess they want to make sure that this is the client who's signed this and it's not fraudulent and somebody else hasn't passed it through. So that the question dealt with whether the insurance company is asking for the client's consent before you send them the declaration for their records. And, you know, insurance companies think they can make up the law. So they're like, no, we don't accept this kind of insurance declaration or that. We want our form or we want to do it online or whatever. Well, they don't get to make those rules. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have a hassle with them, but they're supposed to follow the rules that are for everybody else too. So, well, thanks everybody. If any other questions, I'll leave. We've got a couple of minutes. All right. Hope that you guys find these interesting and useful. And if there's a topic that you want us to cover, we'll be happy to do that. So we're going to come up with a topic for next week. Anybody got, maybe you can put in chat what you would like us to talk about next week. If there's an area of eState that causes you some issues, maybe it's home trusts or residue or something like that we can break down into a 15-minute part. I'd be happy to talk about that. Multiple wills, our advisor insights, any of those things. But we'll come up with one if we don't. We've got lots to go over. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, Jordy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just I put a question in the chat. You sort of answered, but just to clarify. So Manual Life, apparently my client says she has to go online to fill in some sort of a designation, having a hard time figuring it out. If we simply do the designation and send it off to Manual Life, is that sufficient?
Well, I think it's an insurance policy, a declaration under the Insurance Act is done. You can do it in different ways. One of them is online, another is signed, it's valid. And in my view, it's valid.
Okay.
They may then enter it through their system, but I mean, there's no special rule that I'm aware of that says that Manulife gets to say there's only one way to make a designation. So thanks, everybody. Planning out the family tree and residence. That's great. We'll put that on the list for sure. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week and hope to see you on Thursday for Ian and Susanna talking about what did they talk? Discretionary trust, part 2. Thanks. And please feel free to help, reach out to us and support. Thanks. Bye-bye, guys.